Bikers laugh at Grandpa's hat until they meet his friends. The Black Skull Diner, a popular roadside stop, buzzed with its usual lunchtime chatter. Chrome-laden motorcycles lined the parking lot, glinting under the midday sun. Inside, a group of bikers commanded the room, their boisterous laughter and crude jokes drowning out the clinking of cutlery against plates. Colt Viper Rollins, the leader of the pack, leaned back in his booth, boots propped up on the table. His tattooed arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing on his lips as he surveyed his domain. The other bikers, Jax, Ripper, and Spitfire, followed his lead, their raucous behavior unchecked. The bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Conversation lulled as heads turned to assess the newcomer. In walked Hank Dawson, a weathered cowboy in his late 60s. His worn leather jacket and faded jeans spoke of a life well lived, while his eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his cowboy hat, hinted at untold stories. Hank ambled up to the counter, nodding politely to the wide-eyed waitress. "Coffee, black," he requested, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. As the waitress hurried to fill his order, Colt's gaze locked onto Hank. A predatory grin spread across his face. Well, looks like the nursing home let out early today," he sneered, eliciting snickers from his crew. Hank accepted his coffee with a quiet thanks, seemingly unperturbed by the biker's attention. He turned, intending to find a seat, but Colt's voice stopped him. "Hey, old-timer. Nice hat. Did you steal it from a scarecrow?" The bikers erupted into laughter, their eyes gleaming with malice. Hank paused, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly on his mug. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, danced in his eyes before he shook his head and continued on his way. Little did the bikers know, they had just poked a sleeping bear. Hank Dawson was not a man to be trifled with, and his patience had limits. Hank settled into a corner booth, his back to the wall, a habit ingrained from years of vigilance. He sipped his coffee, the bitter liquid scalding his tongue, as he listened to the bikers' continued taunts. "Bet he rode in on a donkey," Jax guffawed, slapping his thigh. "Nah, probably hitched a ride on a tumbleweed," Ripper chimed in, his raspy voice grating on the ears. Colt, however, wasn't content to let Hank be. He swaggered over to the old cowboy's table, his boots thudding heavily on the linoleum floor. "So, Grandpa," he drawled, planting his hands on the tabletop, "what brings a fossil like you to our neck of the woods?" Hank looked up, his blue eyes clear and steady. "Just passing through," he replied evenly. "Thought I'd grab a cup of joe before hitting the road." Colt's lip curled. "Hitting the road, huh? On what, your mobility scooter?" He snorted derisively. "Why don't you do us all a favor and take off that ridiculous hat? It's an insult to real cowboys." The diner fell silent, all eyes on the brewing confrontation. Hank's gaze never wavered as he slowly set down his mug. "Son," he said, his tone measured, "I've worn this hat longer than you've been alive. It's seen more of life than you can imagine. I suggest you mind your manners and let an old man enjoy his coffee in peace." Colt's face reddened, his nostrils flaring. "You don't tell me what to do, old man," he snarled, leaning in closer. "I run this town. And right now, I'm telling you to take off that damn hat before I rip it off your head myself." Hank sighed, a weariness settling over his features. He'd seen men like Colt before, all bravado and no substance. But he knew better than to underestimate the danger of wounded pride. Slowly, deliberately, Hank reached up and touched the brim of his hat. The diner collectively held its breath, waiting for the explosion. But before Colt could make good on his threat, the bell above the door chimed once more. All heads swiveled towards the entrance as a group of well-dressed men stepped inside. They carried themselves with an air of authority, their postures straight and their gazes sharp. The leader, a silver-haired gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard, scanned the room before his eyes settled on Hank. "Hank Dawson," he called out, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I thought that was your bike parked outside." Hank's face split into a grin as he rose to greet the newcomer. "Marcus Weber, you old dog. What brings you to this fine establishment?" Marcus strode forward, clasping Hank's hand in a firm shake. "Oh, you know, just passing through, same as you. Thought I'd drop in and see if the coffee's still as terrible as I remember." The two men shared a laugh, the ease of long friendship evident in their banter. Meanwhile, Colt and his gang watched the exchange with growing unease. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado faltering in the face of these unknown variables. Hank turned to the rest of the group, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Boys, let me introduce you to some old friends of mine. This here's Marcus Weber, former Navy SEAL and current CEO of Weber Security. The gentleman to his right is Jack Raptor Hawkins, ex-Delta Force, and now head of operations at Blackhawk Solutions. And the young buck on the end is Ethan Ghost Cross, former Army Ranger and rising star in the private security world." The men nodded in turn, their gazes assessing the bikers with a cool, professional detachment. Colt swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very much out of his depth. Hank's smile never wavered as he continued, "Now, I couldn't help but overhear your little conversation earlier. Seems you boys have some thoughts on my choice of headwear." Colt's mouth went dry. He licked his lips, trying to formulate a response, but words failed him. The bikers exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had grossly misjudged the situation. Hank leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me give you some friendly advice, son. In this world, it's not about the hat on your head. It's about the character under it. And trust me, you don't want to test the character of the men standing behind me." The tension in the diner was palpable as Hank's words hung in the air. Colt's face had drained of color, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sickening realization of his own foolishness. He glanced at his companions, seeing the same dawning comprehension in their eyes. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Hank, why don't you join us at our table? We have some catching up to do." Hank nodded, a twinkle in his eye. "I'd be delighted, Marcus. It's been too long since we swapped war stories over a cup of joe." As the group of men made their way to a large corner booth, Colt and his gang remained frozen in place, unsure of their next move. Ripper fidgeted with the zipper of his leather jacket, while Spitfire picked at a loose thread on his jeans. Jax leaned in, his voice a harsh whisper. "Colt, man, I don't like this. Those guys, they're not just some random old-timers. They've got operator written all over them." Colt's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He knew Jax was right. The easy camaraderie between Hank and his friends, the way they carried themselves, it all pointed to a shared history of combat and danger. Spitfire piped up, his voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we should just cut our losses, you know? Apologize and get the hell out of here." Colt's eyes flashed dangerously. "Apologize? To that old bastard? Not a chance." He squared his shoulders, a reckless determination settling over him. "We're not going to let some geriatric cowboys run us out of our own town." Ripper and Jax exchanged doubtful looks but said nothing. They knew better than to challenge Colt when he got like this. Across the diner, Hank and his friends settled into their booth, their laughter ringing out as they reminisced about old times. They were oblivious to the simmering resentment brewing in the bikers' corner, the wounded pride that demanded retribution. Little did they know, the true test of character was yet to come. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and the harvest would be bitter indeed. As the afternoon wore on, the diner slowly emptied, the regular patrons drifting back to their daily lives. Hank and his friends lingered, savoring each other's company and the rare opportunity to relive their glory days. Colt and his gang, meanwhile, had retreated to a corner booth, their heads bent together in heated conversation. Colt's face was flushed, his eyes bright with barely suppressed anger. "I'm telling you, we can't let this slide," he hissed, his fist clenching on the tabletop. "If word gets out that we back down from a bunch of old farts, we'll be the laughingstock of the whole damn town." Jax shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between Colt and the group of men across the diner. "I don't know, man. Those guys, they're not just some random old-timers. You saw the way they carried themselves, the way they talked. They've been through some serious shit. Colt's lip curled in a sneer. I don't care if they're goddamn Navy SEALs. This is our turf, and we're not going to let anyone disrespect us on it. Ripper leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. So what's the plan, boss? We can't exactly start a brawl in the middle of the diner. Colt's eyes narrowed, a calculating gleam entering his expression. No, we can't. But we can make sure they understand just who they're messing with. He glanced over at Hank's table, a cruel smile twisting his features. Here's what we're going to do. As the bikers huddled together, plotting their revenge, Hank and his friends remained blissfully unaware of the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They traded war stories and inside jokes, their laughter ringing out in the quiet diner. But even as they enjoyed their reunion, a sense of unease began to creep in, a prickling at the back of their necks that spoke of trouble brewing. They were old soldiers, after all, and they knew better than to ignore their instincts. The stage was set for a confrontation, a clash of wills between the old guard and the new. And in the balance hung the fate of a town, the pride of men, and the very notion of what it meant to be a hero. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, as Hank and his friends finally emerged from the Black Skull Diner. They clapped each other on the back, their faces lined with the contentment of time well spent. Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the parking lot. Hank, didn't you say you rode in on your old Harley? Hank nodded, a fond smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, she's a beauty. A .48 Panhead, restored her myself. But as they approached the spot where Hank had parked his bike, a cold realization settled over them. The Harley was gone, the space empty save for a few scattered oil stains on the asphalt. Hank's face hardened, his eyes narrowing to icy blue slits. Those sons of bitches, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. You think it was those punks from earlier? Hank nodded curtly, his jaw clenched tight. No doubt about it. Colt and his little gang of misfits probably thought they'd teach me a lesson. Ethan cracked his knuckles, a fierce grin splitting his face. Well then, let's go educate them on the error of their ways. But Hank held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. No, boys. This isn't a problem we can solve with fists or bullets. We need to hit them where it really hurts, their pride. Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What did you have in mind? Hank's smile was slow and predatory. We're going to beat them at their own game. Show them what real bikers look like. He turned to Jack, his eyes glinting with mischief. Jack, you still got that old contact at the Harley dealership in the next town over? Jack grinned, catching on to Hank's plan. You bet your ass I do. Give me an hour, and I'll have us a whole damn fleet of hogs. As the men set their plan in motion, a new energy crackled through the air, a sense of purpose and determination. They were old dogs, sure, but they still had plenty of fight left in them. And they were about to show Colt and his crew just what happened when you messed with the wrong pack. The roar of engines shattered the evening calm as a line of gleaming Harleys tore down Main Street. At the head of the pack rode Hank, his silver hair whipping in the wind, a wild grin on his weathered face. Behind him, Marcus, Jack, and Ethan followed in perfect formation, their bikes rumbling with barely contained power. They were a sight to behold, a testament to the enduring spirit of the open road. As they approached the center of town, a crowd began to gather, drawn by the spectacle of these unlikely riders. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, speculation and admiration mingling in equal measure. But it was the reaction of Colt and his gang that truly set the tone. The bikers stood slack-jawed on the sidewalk, their eyes wide with disbelief as Hank and his friends roared past. Colt's face twisted with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. What the hell do they think they're doing? He snarled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. Jack shook his head, a grudging respect in his eyes. They're showing us up, man. Making us look like a bunch of punk kids playing dress-up. Ripper shifted nervously, his gaze darting between Colt and the departing riders. Maybe we should just let it go, you know. Cut our losses and move on. But Colt wasn't listening. His pride had been wounded, his authority challenged in front of the whole damn town. He couldn't let this stand, couldn't let these old bastards get the best of him. Nah, he spat, his voice dripping with venom. This ain't over. Not by a long shot. As Hank and his friends disappeared into the distance, their engines fading to a distant rumble, a new tension settled over the town. The lines had been drawn, the gauntlet thrown down. What had started as a simple clash of egos had escalated into something far more profound, a battle for the very soul of the community. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, one thing became abundantly clear: there would be no easy resolution to this conflict. The seeds of change had been planted, the old ways challenged by the new. And in the days to come, the town of Black Skull would be forced to reckon with the consequences of this fateful confrontation. As dawn broke over Black Skull, the town stirred to life, the events of the previous day still fresh in everyone's minds. In the local diner, patrons huddled over steaming cups of coffee, their voices low and urgent as they rehashed the showdown between Hank's crew and Colt's gang. Opinions were divided, some siding with the bikers' youthful bravado, others admiring the old-timers' grit and style. But one thing was certain: the tension in the air was palpable, a sense of anticipation hanging over the town like a gathering storm. In a quiet corner booth, Hank and his friends sat nursing their own cups of joe, their faces etched with a mix of determination and weariness. They had made their point, had shown Colt and his crew that they weren't to be underestimated. But they knew the battle was far from over. Men like Colt didn't back down easily, didn't accept defeat without a fight. And in a town like Black Skull, where reputation was everything, the stakes were higher than ever. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "We need to be careful, Hank. Those boys, they're not just going to let this go. They'll be looking for blood." Hank nodded, his eyes distant. "I know, Marcus. But we can't back down now. We've got to see this through, for the sake of the town." Jack cracked his knuckles, a fierce grin on his face. "I say we take the fight to them. Show them what real tough looks like." But Ethan shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No, Jack. That's exactly what they want. They're trying to bait us into a confrontation, to make us look like the aggressors." Hank sighed, his fingers drumming on the tabletop. "Ethan's right. We need to be smart about this. Find a way to win over the town, to show them that there's a better way than violence and intimidation." As the men fell into a contemplative silence, the diner buzzed with activity around them. Waitresses hurried between tables, their trays laden with plates of eggs and bacon. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation filled the air, a sense of normalcy that belied the undercurrent of tension. But even as the town went about its daily business, the seeds of change had been planted. The old ways were being challenged, the status quo upended. And in the days to come, the people of Black Skull would be forced to choose sides in a battle that went far beyond leather and chrome. The only question was, which side would they choose? The reckless passion of youth, or the hard-earned wisdom of age? The answer would define the very future of the town itself. As the day wore on, Hank and his friends set about putting their plan into action. They fanned out across the town, engaging with the locals in a way that Colt and his gang never had. Marcus stopped by the local high school, offering to give a guest lecture on leadership and teamwork. Drawing on his years of experience as a Navy SEAL, he captivated the students with tales of courage and sacrifice, instilling in them a sense of purpose and pride. Jack, meanwhile, headed to the town's struggling auto shop. With his expertise in mechanics and his contacts in the industry, he helped the owner secure a lucrative contract with a major parts supplier. The promise of new jobs and economic growth was a welcome ray of hope in a community that had long felt forgotten. Ethan took a different approach, volunteering at the local community center. He organized a series of self-defense classes, teaching the town's most vulnerable residents how to protect themselves from threats both physical and psychological. His gentle demeanor and patient instruction earned him the trust and respect of all who met him. And Hank? He simply did what he had always done best, listen. He spent hours in the diner, the barbershop, the local watering holes, lending an ear to anyone who needed it. He heard their stories, their fears, their dreams for a better future. And in those moments of shared humanity, he began to build the bridges that would ultimately unite the town. Colt and his gang, for their part, could only watch in growing frustration as Hank and his friends slowly but surely won over the hearts and minds of Black Skull. They saw their influence waning, their grip on power slipping away with each passing day. But even as the tide began to turn, Colt refused to back down. His pride, his very identity, was too deeply intertwined with his role as the town's top dog. He would fight tooth and nail to maintain his position, no matter the cost. And so the stage was set for a final, fateful confrontation. Two visions of the future, two ways of life, poised to clash in a battle that would determine the very soul of Black Skull. The tension in Black Skull reached a boiling point on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. The town square, usually a sleepy gathering place for locals, had been transformed into a sea of leather and chrome as Colt and his gang roared into town, their bikes kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. They came to a stop in the center of the square, their engines idling with a menacing growl. Colt dismounted, his eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle. "Listen up, folks," he called out, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm only gonna say this once. This is our town, our turf. And we don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and trying to tell us how to live our lives." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of fear and anticipation. Some nodded in agreement, their loyalty to Colt and his gang unwavering. Others shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to the edges of the square, where Hank and his friends had quietly assembled. Hank stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Colt," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We're not here to tell anyone how to live. We're here because we believe in this town, in its potential for greatness." Colt sneered, his lip curling with disdain. "Greatness? You think a bunch of old farts like you know anything about greatness? You're nothing but a relic, a fossil from a bygone era." But Hank simply smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're right, Colt. We are relics. But that doesn't mean we don't have something to offer. We've seen things, lived through things that you can't even imagine. And we've learned that true greatness comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of Hank's words hanging in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide might turn, that the town might finally reject the path of violence and intimidation. But Colt was not so easily swayed. His face twisted with rage, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "Enough talk," he snarled. "It's time to settle this, once and for all." And with that, he charged forward, his blade glinting in the sunlight, his gang close behind. The final battle for the soul of Black Skull had begun. The clash was fierce and brutal, a whirlwind of fists and fury. Colt and his gang fought with the reckless abandon of youth, their moves fueled by anger and adrenaline. But Hank and his friends had the benefit of experience on their side. They moved with a fluid grace, their attacks precise and calculated. They had faced far worse than a bunch of hot-headed bikers in their time, and they knew how to handle themselves in a fight. Still, the sheer numbers of Colt's gang began to take their toll. For every biker that went down, two more seemed to take their place. Hank found himself backed into a corner, his allies scattered across the square. But just as it seemed that all hope was lost, a new sound filled the air, the roar of engines, the squeal of tires on asphalt. The crowd parted in confusion as a line of gleaming Harleys thundered into the square, their riders clad in the same worn leather as Hank and his friends. At the head of the pack was a face that Hank knew well, Bill "Bulldog" Thompson, his old sergeant from his days in the army. The man had been a legend in his time, a grizzled veteran who had seen action in every corner of the globe. And he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a veritable who's who of the biker world, old-timers and young bloods alike, united by a common bond of brotherhood and respect. They fell upon Colt's gang like a pack of wolves, their fists and boots making short work of the stunned bikers. In a matter of minutes, the tide had turned, the battle all but won. As the dust settled, Hank limped over to where Colt lay sprawled on the ground, his face a mess of blood and bruises. The young biker looked up at him with a mix of fear and awe, his earlier bravado all but gone. "Why?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do this? Why risk everything for a bunch of strangers?" Hank smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. "Because that's what heroes do, son. They stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Even when it costs them everything." And with those words, the battle for Black Skull was over. But the war for its soul had only just begun. In the days that followed, Black Skull underwent a transformation that few could have predicted. With Colt and his gang vanquished, the town's old guard, led by Hank and his friends, stepped in to fill the void. They worked tirelessly to mend the divisions that had long plagued the community, reaching out to the young and the old alike with a message of unity and hope. They organized town hall meetings, listening to the concerns of the people and working to find solutions that benefited everyone. Slowly but surely, the town began to heal. The scars of the past, while never fully erased, began to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose and pride. Hank, for his part, found himself taking on a new role, that of a mentor, a guiding light for the next generation. He spent long hours at the community center, sharing his wisdom and experience with anyone who would listen. He spoke of the power of forgiveness, of the need to let go of old grudges and embrace a brighter future. He taught the young bikers who had once idolized Colt that true strength came not from violence and intimidation, but from compassion and understanding. And as the weeks turned to months, Black Skull began to thrive in a way that it never had before. New businesses opened, old ones flourished. The streets were filled with laughter and music, the air electric with a sense of possibility. Even Colt, the once feared leader of the town's biker gang, found a new path forward. Humbled by his defeat and inspired by Hank's example, he turned his back on his old ways and began to work for the betterment of the community. It was a transformation that few could have predicted, a testament to the power of second chances and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And through it all, Hank and his friends stood tall, their weathered faces etched with the satisfaction of a job well done. They had come to Black Skull as strangers, but they would leave as something more, as heroes, as legends, as the saviors of a town that had once seemed beyond redemption. As the seasons changed and the years passed, Black Skull continued to evolve, shaped by the enduring legacy of Hank and his friends. The town became a beacon of hope, a shining example of what was possible when people put aside their differences and worked together for the common good. The community center, once a rundown shell of a building, was transformed into a thriving hub of activity. It hosted classes and workshops, movie nights and potluck dinners. It became a place where the young and the old could come together, sharing stories and laughter, forging bonds that would last a lifetime. The biker gang, too, underwent a transformation. Under Colt's new leadership, they became a force for good in the town, volunteering their time and energy to help those in need. They repaired homes and built playgrounds, delivered meals to the sick and the elderly. And through it all, Hank remained a constant presence, a guiding light in a world that could often seem dark and uncertain. He continued to mentor the young, to offer wisdom and support to all who sought it. But even the strongest of heroes cannot fight forever. As the years took their toll, Hank began to slow down, his once boundless energy fading like the embers of a dying fire. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his small cottage on the outskirts of town, he was joined by Marcus, Jack, and Ethan. They sat in silence for a long while, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "We did good, didn't we?" Hank said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "We did more than good, Hank. We changed lives. We gave this town a future." Jack and Ethan murmured their agreement, their own faces etched with the weight of the years. And as the last light of day faded from the sky, Hank felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had lived a good life, had made a difference in the world. And though he knew his time was drawing to a close, he took comfort in the knowledge that his legacy would endure, carried forward by the countless lives he had touched. For in the end, that was the true measure of a hero, not the battles won or the enemies vanquished, but the lives forever changed by the power of a simple act of kindness, a single moment of grace. The news of Hank's passing spread through Black Skull like wildfire, a shock wave of grief and remembrance. The town came together as it never had before, united in their love and respect for the man who had changed the course of their history. They gathered in the town square, a sea of faces young and old, biker and businessman alike. They shared stories of Hank's kindness, his wisdom, his unwavering commitment to the greater good. Colt was among them, his eyes red with tears, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of the man who had saved him from himself. "He showed me that there was another way," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. That violence and hate were not the answer. That true strength came from within, from the power of compassion and forgiveness. Marcus, Jack, and Ethan stood beside him, their own faces etched with grief and remembrance. They had lost more than a friend, more than a mentor. They had lost a brother, a shining light in a world that could often seem so dark. But even in their sorrow, they knew that Hank's legacy would live on. They saw it in the faces of the young bikers who had once idolized Colt, now working to make their town a better place. They saw it in the laughter of the children playing in the streets, the smiles of the elderly as they sat in the sun. They saw it in the very fabric of Black Skull itself, a town that had once been torn apart by hate and fear, now united by love and hope. And as the sun began to set on that final, fateful day, Marcus stepped forward, his voice ringing out across the square. "Hank taught us that a single act of kindness, a single moment of grace, could change the world," he said, his eyes shining with tears. "And though he may be gone, his spirit lives on in each and every one of us. So let us honor him, not with our grief, but with our actions. Let us be the heroes that he always knew we could be. Let us make Black Skull a beacon of hope, a shining example of what is possible when we come together as one." And with those words, the town of Black Skull began to heal, to move forward into a brighter, more hopeful future. For though the road ahead would be long and hard, they knew that they would face it together, united by the enduring power of Hank's legacy.